Welcome to the #Finance podcast, part of the Public Entrepreneur Content Network. And this program is proudly sponsored by CSE. I'm here today with Susan Ameel, partner at Global Regulatory Risk Advisors. Hi, Susan. How are you today?
Hi, Grace. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. So could you tell us a little bit more about your role at Global Regulatory Risk Advisors?
Sure. We are a regulatory technology company, and we focus on different emerging risks. One of those risks happens to be cannabis, and so it's a new emerging industry with lots of risks and lots of regulations. And so what we try to do is bring it all together and make it easier for firms in the industry to comply and do what they're supposed to be doing.
That's great. And so what do you think is one of the biggest risks for a cannabis company?
There are a lot of risks. That's a very hard question to answer.
The biggest risk to you?
The biggest risk. I think that, a part of the concern is we obviously, as a CSE, that you have a lot of companies that are going public. And so compliance risk and the legal risks are two huge factors. From a compliance risk perspective, this is a new industry. Firms may not be familiar with compliance and those things they need to do to have efficient controls and a culture of compliance to make sure that their employees are not putting the organization at risk. And from a legal risk perspective, there are a lot of gray areas and a lot of unknown answers. And it's really interesting from my perspective just because you don't have the level of interpretive guidance or enforcement cases that help firms understand and navigate those gray areas.
Yeah. I actually had a podcast this morning with a gentleman that was the CEO of a cannabis company, and he was saying that cannabis companies have to move very fast because of all of the regulatory laws, especially in the States. They kind of change so quickly.
Yes.
So what can you give a little insight into kind of like why they would change so fast in the States and how you've seen cannabis companies keep up?
Sure. We actually have a website called thcregs.com where we monitor the regulatory changes within the United States.
Oh, how accurate are they? To the time that they are released?
We monitor them on a daily basis,
okay.
So we try to provide as much notice or as quick of a notice as possible. But I think what's really interesting and where you'll see over the next year is at the federal level, a lot of industries are preempted by the federal regulations like the securities industry, which means that each state has their own regulations, but generally they fall in line with the umbrella that has been outlined by the federal government. With cannabis and with legislation that's currently being considered by Congress under the States Act, the states have led the charge in developing the industry. And what that means is that you have 50 different regulators ultimately that are going to be regulating hemp production, CBD production, as well as recreational and medical marijuana. And so when you start to look at, the federal regulations that the USDA and the FDA and the SEC have around, the production of the products and the safety for consumers, there's a much heavier regulatory framework at the state level. So each state has their own regulatory framework, and then it goes down to the municipality level. So there are an extensive number of regulations. You really do need technology to help you keep up with it, understand what you need to do, how it impacts your business, and then how to comply.
And what kind of technology is that?
We have a technology called Obedio, and Obedio is a governance, risk, and compliance technology where we have a library of regulations. We have a reg change process where when those regulations change, we update them and then provide you an alert to tell you, okay, you're in California, here this law just went into effect, and this is how the state is adopting the regulation to implement it.
Wow.
And by the way, here are the municipalities and how they're responding to that regulation as well.
Oh, wow. So how do you think that, because one of the CEO that I was speaking to earlier this morning said they have people, on the ground, conversing and actively involved with regulators in different states to before the news is being released. They know about it. How do you think that happens? Like, is that legal? Is that something that you're seeing?
Well, the really interesting thing about regulations is that every regulation tells a story, and regulations are adapted to mitigate a risk that exists. And so a regulator might identify risks when they go to do an inspection or an audit, and where they might identify a problem that poses a risk to consumers, poses a risk to the overall society. And so they need input because they're not in the business of running a dispensary or growing marijuana, so they need input from the industry on what effective practices can be put in place to mitigate that risk. So it's really a great process to bring in the industry and really get the most effective answer to the regulators' questions and what they're trying to mitigate or get rid of. And there's a process called the American Procedures Act, where the regulators have to publish the regulations. The public has an opportunity to comment and provide feedback, and then the regulator can take that into consideration before issuing a final regulation.
Okay. And so going back to the technology that you're using for people to get these alerts, is there are you using any kind of blockchain or security technology for this?
I think there is. I think DC is using blockchain. Okay. So something for their technology, but no. So our technology is really it's a workflow tool that is really an amped up database that allows you to have a lot of regulations, do associations. And I think where we provide value is we try to rationalize similar obligations across the states. Okay. So where you might have 50 different obligations, we try to show you, hey, you can do this and satisfy all 50, and really boil it down to one thing that a entity should do to comply with the regulations.
Okay. And how many people use your platform?
We are rolling out the platform right now, so we're continually growing, and we are a startup, so hopefully we'll have a lot of users.
Oh, great. Have you gotten any feedback thus far?
We have, and what's really interesting is the feedback that we're getting is that firms want to focus the regulations on really growing revenues as well as complying the regulations. So within the cannabis industry, you need to be able to identify where you can obtain licenses to engage in activity. So a lot of the companies that are listed on the CSE are actually vertically integrated, which means they grow, they process, they manufacture and sell it through their dispensaries. But they need to find a city where they can engage in these activities within a state. So what we do is we take the regulations and we pull out that information that will help these organizations identify, oh, that's where I can go to get a license, and be there in the front of the line before everybody else tries to get that license, because they really are in a limited supply. And it's very difficult to obtain.
Yeah. And how do you see the competition landscape for cannabis companies? I mean, you're offering like a technology for other companies to kind of get a leg up in a state. But how do you see a company really getting the majority of the people in a state as customers? What would be their advantage?
Right. And I at this point in time, we're seeing a lot of consolidation in the industry. So, for example, if you can't obtain a license, the other alternative is to buy somebody who has a license. And this is growing very complex because a lot of the local municipalities that are opting into marijuana and cannabis want to make sure that their local residents participate within the revenue. And so there's this balancing act between making sure that your local citizens and those people who have been unfairly impacted by prior drug regulations participate in the new industry. But also, those individuals need capital, and there is a lot of capital that people raise by listing on the CSE that can be used to really build out a business in a much quicker fashion and generate more revenues for the cities and the states.
Okay, great. And so you have a little bit of history working with a stock exchange. And which stock exchanges were those?
I worked at the American Stock Exchange and the National Stock Exchange. But I've over time I've worked with a number of them.
Okay, and seeing this cannabis industry, or this bubble, I guess it's interesting times. Could you relate back to another industry that was quite similar, where there was a lot of excitement and people don't really know what to expect? And
this is I've never seen anything like this.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I give the individuals who really move this industry along a lot of credit, because especially working in regulated industries, we're so used to hearing no, and you tend to give up. And these people actually did a wonderful job, the advocates and the entrepreneurs, to build an industry where now it's facing legalization in the United States. So I haven't seen that type of industry in my career. But when we go back to the .com era back in the late 90s, where it was this brand new industry called the internet, and all of the companies that were kind of jumping in. It seems a little similar, depending upon what happens over the next couple of years, and the ability for firms to maintain and to make the sufficient revenues to stay in business, given the high levels of fees and taxes and competition that they're facing in the industry.
Yeah. So do you think it'll have the same? Do you think that the cannabis industry will have the same end result as the .com industry?
Ultimately, everything's a .com right now.
Yeah.
So we hope.
Yeah, exactly.
But hopefully they won't go through the growing pains that the .com industry went through in the late 90s.
What were those growing pains?
I think that there was just such a rush to get in, and there was an overinflation of prices, and perhaps not, the business plans weren't as profitable as they could have been. So you saw a great anticipation for future revenues that may not have been there, and so the companies may not have lasted as long as they should.
And so you have your JD, which is very impressive. And for those of you that don't know, a JD, and correct me if I'm wrong, is doing your law degree and your MBA at the same time.
Oh no, that's
no. Or is that
so
a JD MBA?
Yeah,
okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So what's the JD?
I'm just a lawyer.
Okay, sorry. Not just a lawyer. Don't.
I don't practice law anymore, but
yeah. So what law did you want to practice when you first got out of law school? Like, what was your kind of goal?
This is kind of embarrassing. But I remember reading Barbarians at the Gate when I was
What's Barbarians at the Gate?
It's this story about finance and KKR and Nabisco and all these great companies, and I had wanted to work in the finance field, and so I went to law school, and my first job out of law school happened to be on a trading floor, and I thought I was the luckiest person in the world.
Which trading floor was that?
That was a trading floor in Michigan, for a company that had been sold, but it was the greatest experience. It was during the .com era. It was very exciting. It was the beginning of electronic trading, and which obviously the world is now. We're moving on to blockchain. We've moved past the automation aspect and moving to blockchain technology. So it's been a fantastic ride, and I look forward to the excitement in the cannabis industry as well.
That's great. But what kind of lawyer did you want to be, like when you first got out?
I wanted to be a regulatory lawyer.
Okay, regulatory. Okay, yes, always wanted to be a regulatory lawyer.
I like regulations.
Okay. What is it about regulations that you like?
It's the history, it's the story that the regulations tell. So any regulation that you see, something happened where the lawmaker said, we need a regulation to make sure this never happens again. So when you look at the securities regulations, you had the crash in 1929 and other scandals that led to the development and the adoption and enactment of additional laws and regulations.
Oh, interesting. And so did you ever want to regulate something yourself back in the day? Like, And if so, what was it?
Well, I worked at a couple of regulators. I worked at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I was a regulator at an exchange as well. I think regulators do an important job, and they make sure that the wheels stay on the vehicle and the vehicle stays on the road. There are downsides, meaning what happens to innovation when you have too much enforcement and the regulators are not focused on helping an industry innovate and become more efficient, but become more comfortable in ensuring that the long-time policies that they have stay in place. And so that's when I look at the state regulators within the cannabis industry. They really are doing that, which is helping the industry and coming up with the right solution that protects everyone, but yet allows the industry to continue growing.
Oh, that's great. And so you're from New York, right?
I'm from Michigan originally.
Michigan originally, but you're living in New York.
I'm living in New York,
okay.
correct.
And what part of New York? I haven't been to New York yet. I want to go soon.
I am a new resident of Hell's Kitchen.
Of Hell's Kitchen?
Yes.
Where's that?
Well, it's where you would expect hell to be. No.
I thought you meant the show.
No, so Hell's Kitchen is near Times Square, but
okay.
It has a real character about it, and there's been a lot of growth over the last couple of years, but it still doesn't lose its character.
That's great. And do you frequent Toronto? You come to Toronto a lot?
Growing up in Michigan, I used to come to Canada all the time.
Yeah.
In fact, I do want to say that I did swim to Canada, even though my family says that I did not. We lived in a town that was on a river directly across from Canada. And so
you used to swim to Canada. That's interesting.
Well, I swam to Canada. My family debates whether or not it actually happened, but it did.
It definitely did. Yeah,
definitely.
And so you're here for the Benzinga conference.
I'm here for the Benzinga conference, which I think is really important, given the lack of access to capital that the industry has right now. These events are really important, and it's really important for these companies that are struggling to keep up with demand, struggling to put in the legal and compliance systems that they need to reduce and mitigate risks, to find partners who are willing to go on that ride and really give them the capital to grow their businesses.
Yeah, and what kind of neat stories have you seen at the conference?
At the conferences are what I love about the conference is the number of entrepreneurs that come up with an idea and they execute, and they not only execute, but they do it in a way that is really remarkable. So every story there is a background as far as how they started, how many couches they slept on before they actually were able to get the capital needed to build out their dream. So that's great. And I guess another question I just wanted to ask was another conversation I had today was saying the CEO of the cannabis company had said that a lot of these cannabis companies need the funds or the capital to be able to have a leg up on regulatory law. Are there any other resources other than your website just to get a leg up on what's going on before the law goes out? Like what can they do that's cost effective to kind of battle that kind of There are a lot of resources, and another thing I've been very impressed with the state regulators is the level of guidance that they provide to the industry. They do a lot of the work for the industry that normally, the industry would hire consultants or lawyers to do for them. So, California, Oregon, Washington, Michigan, Massachusetts, they all issue a tremendous amount of guidance on what their expectations are for the industry and complying with the regulations. They provide checklists, they provide cheat sheets, they provide their inspection guides, which you don't normally see within the other industries that I have worked in, is that they actually tell you, we're going to come in and this is what we're going to look for, which obviously you should be able to, take that list and check to make sure that you have everything in place. So there's a tremendous amount of information out there. I think the problem is just that there's so much information.
Yes, how do you collect it all?
And how do you collect it all? And how do you synthesize? Because at the end of the day, you really want that culture of compliance where I, as an organization, I should have my policies and my procedures and the standards that are not going to be, okay, we're going to do this in California, we're going to do this in Massachusetts and this in Michigan. We should have an enterprise system where we have enterprise policies that drive the culture and drive compliance with the regulations. And the regulators can look to that to see exactly how they're fulfilling the individual requirements.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. And you probably had a long day at the conference, and we really appreciate you stopping by.
Oh, thanks for having us, and I love the CSE. You guys are doing a great job, so
thank you.
Keep doing it. Thanks.
Thanks. Hi, it's Grace from the CSE reminding you to make sure to follow us on social media for the latest updates on our listed companies as well as new listing alerts. For more in-depth content, be sure to pick up our free quarterly magazine, Public Entrepreneur, available online at thecsc.com.